If you work with someone else to write a song, and it could be you write the music and someone else writes the words, or you both collaborate in writing the music, but if you work together and you intend to create this single work together, you're both considered to be co-authors of the song, and each of you has an undivided, if there are two of you, has an undivided interest in the entire song. So even if one person contributed 90% and the other person contributed 10%, each person has a complete undivided interest that you share in that song. And under U.S. law, either of you can license the use of that song to anyone else without having to ask the co-author's permission. The sole condition to that is if you've got to pay the other person their share of the royalties, but you don't need the permission to do that. So that's a very important point to keep in mind when you collaborate with other people. A work for hire is a work that is either created by someone as part of their employment, in which case the employer owns the copyright and not the actual creator. Or in some cases, if someone commissions a work for use in certain kind of works. The Copyright Act lists 9 categories of works that can qualify as a work for hire for commissioned work. A sound recording is not one of them. Was for a time, and that got repealed from the Copyright Act. But it can be a collective work, which is a sort of anthology. It could be a motion picture. So if someone commissions you to write music for a motion picture, let's say, and there's a writing that says this is a work for hire, the person who commissions you is the author and owns the copyright, not you. And you're not a joint author. It's the commissioning party that is the author in that case, if it's a work for hire, not the actual creator. Co-authors can do that, right? So if someone collaborates with you in writing a song, and the arrangement is that you're going to be the sole author, not them, they could assign to you whatever rights they have. But that's got to be in writing. In order for a copyright assignment to be effective, it has got to be in writing, signed by the person who's assigning the copyright. Yeah, with digital technology, one creative tool that is increasingly used by many musicians and recording engineers is sampling. At least sampling really began principally as part of sort of predecessor to hip-hop music. It was really a central part of the cultural aesthetic of hip-hop music. And through the 1980s, it was a practice that was widely engaged in and generally perceived to be not an infringement of copyright, because it involved just the taking of a couple notes from an existing sound recording. But beginning in the late 1980s, a couple courts began to say that sampling is an infringement of copyright. It depends on how much is taken and whether the sampler takes sort of the very key, most sort of heart of the work, or whether it's something which is not the key to the work. And really since then, record labels have begun to insist that those who want to sample have got to clear licenses for sampling. And as a result of that, the practice of sampling, at least for commercial sound recordings, has really declined substantially. Top hip artists today still sample, but have much fewer samples on each track than used to be the case, because it's just very expensive to clear the rights in samples. So the law today is basically that sampling might be a fair use, depending on how long it is and what's taken, but is not always going to be a fair use, or sometimes what's called a de minimis copying. If only 1 or 2 notes is taken, then it is likely, might not be an infringement of the copyright in the musical composition. There's one recent case in the Sixth Circuit which held that with respect to the sound recording, so when someone digitally samples an existing sound recording, they are copying both the notes in the musical composition and also in the sound recording, which are 2 distinct separate works. So at least according to this court, even if you sample 1 or 2 notes from a sound recording, there is no de minimis exception. It might be fair use, but it is prima facie infringement of copyright. So there's a different rule. It's more strict for the sound recording than it is for the musical composition. That decision has been widely criticized. I personally think it's very poorly reasoned, but that is sort of a note of caution to those who engage in sampling. So I think today, many musicians who sample either just hope they won't get caught or bury the samples deep within their tracks, so it's difficult to discover what is the source of the sample. And at least for the musical composition, that actually it's, in some ways, that's a legitimate practice recognized under copyright law, because one of the tests for whether copying is de minimis and therefore is not infringing is whether a typical audience would recognize what the source of the sample is. So if the sample is very short and it's buried within the track and no one will recognize where it comes from, then it's a good argument that it's not infringing. But many musicians think that, well, if you only copy less than 5 notes, it's not a copyright infringement. And that's really an urban legend. It's not true. It depends on what notes you're copying and whether or not they're recognizable and what the court thinks of it. Whether or not it's going to be infringement on one hand or fair use or de minimis on the other. If you don't sample, but rather make a new recording of the notes that you otherwise would have wanted to sample, then you're not copying the sound recording. So there's no need to clear rights from the owner of the copyright in the sound recording, because the owner of the copyright in the sound recording only controls the rights to actually physically duplicate the sounds that were recorded, not to recreate them from studio musicians in the studio. At the same time, though, you probably do have to clear the rights and not enjoy the compulsory license from the owner of the rights in the musical composition, because the compulsory license for cover recordings only applies if you haven't distorted or significantly changed the melody of the original. And in fact, the law isn't clear, but if you're only recreating a couple notes of the original and then merging it into your own composition, you probably don't fall within that restriction on the compulsory license. So you probably do have to clear the rights to the musical composition.
I always love when I'm teaching my class and we start talking about sampling, and everybody, for all the articles that have been written in all the guitar player magazines, there's still that thing, 4 bars is okay. I keep asking, I say, so suppose we did blah, blah, blah. Inevitably, every semester, some kid will say, well, 4 bars is okay, right? No, wrong. It might be okay, depending on what 4 bars it is, but if it's a sample, and if you're in the 6th Circuit, nothing's okay, okay? The whole idea, though, I think that's interesting now, that's sort of the next step along from that, is mashups. This whole idea of, we're going to take a couple different recordings, or 3 or 4 different recordings, or recording in a movie, and we're going to digitally superimpose them on each other and make something new that incorporates both those things. The people who do it on the audio side, they're used to the idea that, hey, if I use a song, I can get compulsory licenses. Forget that compulsory licenses don't work if you change the character of the composition you're using. So if you sample it and put it into another song, you've changed the character. If you do a mashup, you've changed the character. If you do a medley, you've changed the character.
A copyright in a song or a painting or whatever lasts, which seems like a really long time, and it is. It lasts for the life of the creator plus 70 years. So clearly your heirs or your assigns are going to be having rights long after you're dead in a song or a book. Now, what often happens is early on in one's career, one assigns the copyright to a publisher, a music publisher, a book publisher, just to use 2 examples. So they assign their 100% share of their copyright rights to a publisher in exchange for a royalty stream or an income stream split. The copyright law now provides that 35 years after you've made a complete assignment of rights to a party, you can say, no, sorry, didn't mean it, mistake, want my copyright back. So there's a reversion possibility. And you have to go through all these notice things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is the possibility of basically getting out of a deal that you never wanted. If you think about it, you're usually making those deals at your lowest point of leverage. right? You have no success, you have no track record, you have nothing, you're a beginning artist. So you get into deals that are not exactly sometimes considered fair later on. So copyright law gives you the ability to have the copyright revert back to your ownership after 35 years.
The 35-year reversion, let me explain what that is. The 1976 copyright law, which came into effect January 1st, 1978, provided that the author, pursuant to an assignment of their copyright, could recapture that copyright 35 years later. So 35 years from 1978 is 2013. Now, there's no definition of author. Okay. And there are 9 categories in the Copyright Act in which this can occur. One of them, 9 categories, I'm sorry, that cannot occur, and those are called work for hire. So if I have been engaged by a company under a work for hire arrangement, I cannot get recapture because it's not an assignment of copyright. The copyright is owned from the beginning by the employer. There are 2 categories, 2 essential categories, and then we divide the second category by 9. First category is I'm an employee. By that I mean a real employee. They take out taxes. I have workman's comp. The full definition if you're working for a company. Anything. Then if I sign a document that says anything I create while I'm your employee is a work made for hire. That's a valid work made for hire, and you cannot recapture that. The second category, which is more elusive, is where I have assigned my copyright to somebody pursuant to an agreement. And if it's one of 9 categories, then it can be a work for hire. Example, audio-visual work, a motion picture as an example. Motion picture is a work made for hire. When a motion picture company employs somebody, the musicians, the actors, the director, the writer, the singers, or whoever else may be employed they are signed to a work made for hire, which means no individual who worked on that motion picture can recapture it 35 years later or at any time unless there's a contractual reason. There are 9 categories. Audiovisual is one of them. Compilations is another. Contributions to collectible works is another. Tests are another. Answers to tests another. But there's no category called sound recordings. So it is the position of many of us, myself included, that the sound recording is subject to being recaptured because it is not defined as one of the 9 categories that can be assigned as a work made for hire, and therefore the author has a right to recapture that 35 years later. Now we get into the real issue. Who's the author? Is it the featured artist? Is it the feature artist and the producer? Is it the feature artist, the producer, and the engineer? Who is the author? We don't know who the author is. And what I believe is going to happen is we're going to get a substantial litigation at some point in the relatively near future in the definition of who is an author. Now, I think the record companies are going to try and claim that they're an author, but they certainly can't claim it by reason of the fact that it's a work made for hire because it's not one of the 9 categories. And the artists who work for record companies in doing a recording contract, that is not an employer situation. So it'll be an interesting battle. My belief is that ultimately the featured artist and possibly the producer along with the feature may be the authors entitled to recapture. But you and I are also aware of many records that are done by producers without artists or virtually without artists. That artists are brought in as another instrument and put on that record. So maybe the author is only the producer in that particular instance. I don't know. But the litigation on this is going to be very interesting over the next several years.
Well, the first thing I think you should do is certainly file a copyright with the U.S. Copyright Office, which is a very expensive proposition now at $45 a registration. Now, many people will put it in the form of a collection or a compilation with a title and a number of tracks and file that under one form. That certainly makes sense. I think that that is at least a way to protect as many songs as possible under one registration, although it can be a double-edged sword. Because at some point, if one of those songs on that compilation becomes popular and becomes valuable, then it's very important to go back in and file a separate registration, which you're allowed to do, for that particular song. I had an incident in my law practice where I had a client that one of the songs was sampled on an artist who sold about 700,000 units. And he couldn't find his copyright registration. He says, I know I filed a copyright for this song, but I just can't find it. And without the registration, you can't go into federal court. Well, finally, after a month or two of research, he finally found that he had filed it under a compilation, with about 12 songs on one registration form, and that enabled us to be able to proceed. So it's very important. I think I advise people that don't have a lot of money, because I know $45, if you want to do that per song, is going to be prohibitive for most new artists. But if you're going to do that, then it's very important to recognize that as the value of the particular song increases, that it's important to go back in, pull that out, and file it under a separate form.
Well, the C in the circle just is a copyright claim, basically, I guess, for the song, you would say. The P in a circle generally represents for the sound recording, but it's all just a copyright notice. In the old copyright law, pre-76, there was some provision that said if you didn't put your notice on there, you could potentially waive your copyright. You could lose your copyright. But in the day and age where copies were proliferating, it was difficult. And you had a label and a distributor and all these different people, and if just one of those people messed up, everyone could lose the copyright. It seemed unfair. So eventually, in the 76, so post-78, when the new 76 Copyright Law Act came out, they took that out. So it's a notice provision, C. Usually it's C, meaning copyright notice, or P, name of the owner. So it might be you, Joe Smith, Joe Schmo as a songwriter, or Sony Records as a record label, and then the year of the copyright, which could be 1978, 2007. So that you see in the circle name and the year. But it's not a requirement. But it's a good idea to put it, because in effect, you're putting the world on notice that you have a copyright.
I'm fundamentally in favor, pro-copyright. The important thing to remember, though, is that there's no such thing as copyright that has remained fixed and constant over the last 200 years. Instead, it's radically changed as technologies have changed and as the industries have changed. So what I'm in favor of is copyright that, like its history, changes as technologies require a different mix of rights. And so I'm an opponent to copyright built for a different age, right? I don't think copyright built for the analog world makes sense in the digital world. Now, unlike some, my response to that is not to say, therefore, abolish copyright. My response is to say, let's make copyright make sense for the digital world. Well, the obvious one for me is the duration of copyright, which it seems to me has far exceeded any possible rational justification. And it has exceeded it not because people are trying to create more incentives to artists to create, but instead because they're trying to make sure that old creativity doesn't pass into the public domain and they lose the opportunity to profit from it. So that's an obvious one. But the less obvious ones that I think are actually more likely to be changed would be, first of all, to recognize the totally unnecessary regulation of copyright in the context of non-commercial derivative works. So you have an explosion of kids, for example, using the internet to produce all sorts of fantastically creative derivative works. These don't compete with the artist's original work at all. They're demonstrating the creative potential of these kids and the technology, and they're being shared not in a commercial context where people are selling it, but just in the way that you share jokes that you might make up about a television show. There's no reason for copyright to be regulating that. And so one simple change would be to just restrict the derivative rights to commercial derivative rights, not non-commercial derivative rights. Another question to think about is whether it makes sense for copyright to be regulating copies. That sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but for most of the history of copyright in the United States, copyright did not grant copyright owners the exclusive right to copy. It granted copyright owners the exclusive right to do things like distribute their work commercially or engage in commercial derivative rights, but not copy. That was added to the law in 1909. Many think really as a sort of drafting mistake. It wasn't proper to refer to what the law was regulating as regulating copies, but that's what it did. And when it was added, what it basically said was that the law of copyright would expand as the technologies for copying became more pervasive. Now, again, I think until digital technologies came along, that was probably a fine proxy for regulating commercial activity, right? Because the only people who had printing presses were commercial publishers, and so it made sense to regulate commercial publishers in the context of copyright. But now that basically everybody who has a computer constantly engages in copying because there's no way to use creative work on a digital network without producing a copy, then I think it raises the question whether we shouldn't be rethinking the fact that copyright regulates copies. And instead of regulating every copy through copyright, we might think about regulating commercial distribution or commercial exploitation, commercial derivative works. That's the kind of activity that copyright law is properly regulating, rather than just regulating every time somebody wants to make a creative use of somebody else's creativity. Copyright law was originally crafted imagining that there's a relatively small number of creators out there, and to the extent it's expensive to navigate copyright law, record companies and film studios and publishers would be able to bear that expense because it's for small commercial entities. Now the world is such that basically anybody's a creator. Anybody with a computer and access to the internet can begin to create and share their creativity. Pew just released a study that said that 57% of teenagers in the United States had produced and shared content on the internet, right? So it was a huge number of creators. And the problem is that copyright law written for the world of publishers and record labels now applies to the world of creators, as in anybody who has access to the internet. And that copyright law is just too burdensome for those creators to actually be able to navigate. So the idea of Creative Commons was, let's lower the cost of the law in this process of creativity. Not by telling people to ignore the law, but by making it function more cheaply, more efficiently, more invisibly to the system, so that you respect the rights, but you still are free to engage in creative work that the technology of the internet is inviting people to engage in.